At precisely 3:15 a.m., over 3,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The sound can be heard 50 miles away, a rolling thunder that tears through the pre-dawn silence like the end of the world. High explosive shells obliterate Soviet border posts, communication centers, military barracks. Soldiers are sleeping in their beds. They die without ever knowing the war has started. 15 minutes later, the Luftwaffe crosses into Soviet airspace. Over 1,800 aircraft, the largest air assault ever attempted in history, fly toward their targets. German pilots have been briefed. They expect minimal resistance. Their primary objective, Soviet airfields. Destroy the planes on the ground and the Red Air Force ceases to exist. As the sun begins to rise, the first wave of bombers reaches their destinations. What they discover exceeds their wildest expectations. Hundreds of Soviet aircraft are parked in neat, orderly rows, completely exposed. No camouflage netting covers them. No dispersal protocols have been implemented. Anti-aircraft batteries remain silent. It's a turkey shoot. German bombs fall like apocalyptic rain. Within the first 2 hours of the invasion, the Soviet Air Force loses 1,200 aircraft. The majority are destroyed before they ever leave the ground. Soviet pilots arrive at their airfields to find nothing but twisted metal and burning wreckage. By the end of the first day, the Luftwaffe has achieved complete air superiority across the entire front. On the ground, Soviet border guards are equally unprepared. Many units have received no warning whatsoever. In the weeks before the invasion, some commanders detected German troop movements. They reported it up the chain of command. They were ordered not to provoke the enemy. Stalin himself issued strict instructions forbidding any action at all, that might be interpreted as aggression toward Germany. The Soviet dictator remains utterly convinced that Hitler would never attack while still fighting Britain in the West. Stalin is catastrophically wrong. German panzer divisions smash through Soviet defensive positions like battering rams through paper walls. The Blitzkrieg tactics that conquered Poland in weeks, that brought France to its knees in 40 days, now devastate Soviet defenses with terrifying efficiency. Tank columns advance so rapidly that Soviet commanders lose track of where the front lines actually are. Radio communications have been destroyed in the opening artillery barrage. Supply depots burn. Command structures disintegrate into chaos. General Heinz Guderian leads his Panzer Group 2 through a gap near Brest-Litovsk. His tanks advance 50 miles on the first day alone. They encounter scattered resistance from bewildered Soviet units who have no idea what's happening. No orders, no communication with headquarters. In Moscow, reports flood into the Kremlin. Stalin refuses to believe them. Here's what makes this disaster even more tragic, even more preventable. Stalin wasn't surprised by this invasion. He was warned, over and over and over again. In Tokyo, a Soviet spy named Richard Sorge has been feeding Moscow intelligence from inside the German embassy. On May 30th, 1941, 3 weeks before the invasion, Sorge sent a telegram to Moscow. German attack will commence in the latter part of June. Stalin ignored it. On June 20th, just 2 days before the invasion, Sorge sent another urgent message. War is inevitable. Stalin dismissed it as disinformation. Between January 1st and June 21st, 1941, over 100 separate intelligence warnings were forwarded to Stalin's desk. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill sent personal telegrams warning of the German buildup. The Chinese Communist Party alerted Moscow. German deserters crossed the lines to warn Soviet commanders of the exact date. Stalin ignored every single warning. Why? Because Stalin trusted no one. His paranoia, the same paranoia that led him to execute tens of thousands of Red Army officers in the purges of 1937 and 1938, now convinced him that these warnings were British tricks. He believed Churchill was trying to manipulate him into a war with Germany. When his intelligence chief showed him Sorge's reports, Stalin called the spy a shit who has set himself up with some little factories and brothels in Japan. He refused to believe his own intelligence network. Stalin had convinced himself that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the non-aggression treaty signed with Nazi Germany in 1939, would hold. He had personally overseen the delivery of massive quantities of strategic resources to Germany: grain, oil, manganese rubber. Soviet trains carrying raw materials to feed the German war machine crossed paths with German troop, trains moving toward the invasion staging areas. The final Soviet supply train entered German territory just hours before the attack began. The irony is almost too bitter to comprehend. At 3:30 in the morning on June 22nd, as German shells are already falling on Soviet positions, Defense Commissar Timoshenko and General Zhukov call Stalin at his dacha outside Moscow. "We are being fired upon," they report. "What should we do?" Stalin still doesn't believe it's a full invasion. He thinks it might be a provocation by rogue German generals, trying to start a war Hitler doesn't want. He tells his commanders to investigate before responding. Hours pass. The reports become undeniable. German armies are pouring across the frontier in 3 massive spearheads. Stalin finally accepts reality, but he's paralyzed. For 11 days, the Soviet dictator withdraws from public view. His subordinates don't know if he's having a mental breakdown or simply doesn't know what to do. Finally, on July 3rd, 11 days after the invasion began, Stalin addresses the Soviet people by radio. His voice is shaken, unsteady. He calls the citizens brothers and sisters, an unprecedented informal address from a dictator who has ruled through terror. He acknowledges the gravity of the situation, and he calls for total war. Every factory will produce weapons. Every citizen will fight. Nothing, absolutely nothing, will be left for the invaders. The scorched earth policy begins. Immediately, the German invasion plan is elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. 3. Massive army groups attack simultaneously. Army Group North drives toward Leningrad. Army Group South aims for Ukraine's agricultural heartland and the Caucasus oil fields beyond. And in the center, the most powerful force ever. Assembled Army Group Center races toward Moscow. German intelligence had estimated the Soviets possessed maybe 150 divisions in the western military districts. They calculated perhaps 50 more could be brought up as reinforcements. The actual number, over 360 Soviet divisions, would eventually be committed to the defense. The Germans had no idea what they were up against. But in these opening weeks, their underestimation doesn't seem to matter. The Wehrmacht is achieving victories on a scale that defies comprehension. Near Bialystok and Minsk, German pincers close around Soviet forces. Over 300,000 Red Army soldiers are encircled. Most are killed or captured within days. At Smolensk, hundreds of thousands more. Then comes Kiev. Hitler makes a controversial decision in August. Army Group Center has advanced to striking distance of Moscow. His panzer commanders, Guderian and the others, are begging him to authorize an immediate push toward the Soviet capital. Take Moscow, they argue, and the Soviet Union collapses. Hitler overrules them. He orders the panzer divisions to wheel south, to help Army Group South encircle Soviet forces defending Kiev. From a purely military standpoint, it seems logical. Destroy the enemy's armies rather than chase symbolic objectives. The Kiev encirclement becomes the largest in military history. Over 650,000 Soviet soldiers are killed or captured. An entire Soviet army group ceases to exist. But this decision cost Germany something irreplaceable. Time. September arrives. Then October. The window for capturing Moscow before winter narrows with each passing day. During the first 6 weeks of the invasion, the Soviet Union is suffering an average of 46,000 casualties per day. Entire divisions are being wiped out. The Red Army is bleeding to death. But Soviet resistance, though disorganized, is often ferocious in a way German soldiers have never experienced in Western Europe. Individual units fight to the death rather than surrender. Political commissars shoot soldiers who attempt to retreat. Officers who abandon their positions face execution by NKVD security troops. The Germans are also discovering problems with their own plan. Tank units are advancing so fast they're outrunning their fuel supplies. Panzer divisions sometimes have to halt for days while supply trucks catch up. The Soviet rail system uses a different gauge than European railways, requiring time-consuming conversion of captured track. And most critically, German planners had prepared for a short campaign. Hitler expects victory before winter. The Wehrmacht possesses insufficient winter clothing, no antifreeze for vehicles, no specialized cold weather equipment. This assumption will prove catastrophic. But there's something else happening during this invasion, something that goes far beyond normal military operations. This isn't just a war of conquest. Hitler has initiated a war of racial extermination. Since the 1920s, core Nazi ideology has centered on three objectives: the destruction of the Soviet Union, the elimination of the communist threat, and the seizure of Lebensraum, living space, for the Germanic race. Hitler's book Mein Kampf explicitly called for German expansion eastward. He viewed Slavic peoples as subhuman, fit only for slave labor or extermination. Before the invasion began, Hitler issued the Barbarossa Decree on March 30, 1941. This order declared that the coming war would be one of annihilation. It legally sanctioned the eradication of communist leaders and Soviet elites. The Commissar Order authorized the immediate execution of all captured political officers. Wehrmacht officers told their soldiers they were fighting against Jewish Bolshevik subhumans, against Mongol hordes, against an Asiatic flood threatening European civilization. Behind the advancing German armies came special SS units called Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads. Their mission: to execute all less valuable Asiatics, Gypsies, and Jews. The Holocaust in the Soviet Union began not in gas chambers, but with bullets. From late July 1941, these SS and police units began systematically shooting entire Jewish communities. Men, women, children. Entire villages marched to pits they were forced to dig themselves, then machine-gunned. By the end of 1942, at least 1.1 million Jewish men, women, and children had been murdered in mass shootings across occupied Soviet territory. But here's the truly horrifying statistic. 6 months into the invasion, the Einsatzgruppen had already murdered over 500,000 Soviet Jews. That's more than the number of Red Army soldiers killed in battle during the same period, and Soviet prisoners of war faced conditions that can only be described as genocidal. Between the launch of Barbarossa and the spring of 1942, 2.8 million of the 3.2 million Soviet soldiers captured by the Germans died. They were deliberately starved to death, worked to death, shot, or left to die of exposure. This was intentional. Part of something called the Hunger Plan, a deliberate policy to reduce the population of Eastern Europe through mass starvation. A German decree issued on September 8, 1941 stated that the use of weapons against Soviet prisoners of war was to be regarded as legal. Over 3.3 million of the 5.7 million Soviet POWs captured during the entire war would die in German custody, a death rate of 57%. Compare that to the 3.5% death rate for British and American POWs held by Germany. This wasn't war. This was extermination. And these atrocities had a strategic consequence that Hitler and his generals never anticipated. Soviet civilians who might have welcomed liberation from Stalin's brutal regime instead became implacable enemies. Nazi occupation policies guaranteed that every Soviet citizen would fight to the death rather than submit. German forces burned entire villages in reprisal for partisan activity. This created more partisans. Soviet resistance fighters emerged in German rear areas, attacking supply convoys and communication lines. The Wehrmacht had to divert desperately needed troops to anti-partisan operations. Hitler's ideology was becoming a strategic liability. While German armies advance, Stalin's regime does something extraordinary. The Soviet Union begins the most massive industrial evacuation in human history. As Red Army units retreat, they destroy everything of value. Factories are systematically dismantled. Machinery is loaded onto trains. Workers and their families climb aboard with the equipment. These trains travel hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles east, beyond the reach of German bombers. To the Ural Mountains, to Siberia, to Central Asia. Within months, these evacuated factories resume production in their new locations. Facilities in the Urals and Siberia begin churning out T-34 tanks, Il-2 Sturmovik ground attack aircraft, millions of artillery shells. Soviet industrial production, though disrupted by the invasion, actually continues to grow, and help is coming from abroad. American and British aid begins flowing to the USSR under the Lend-Lease program. Trucks, jeeps, canned food, boots, locomotives, thousands of other critical items supplement Soviet production. This assistance frees Soviet industry to concentrate on weapons, while Western supplies provide logistical support. German production cannot keep pace. Stalin's totalitarian system, for all its brutality and inefficiency, proves remarkably resilient under the stress of total war. The Communist Party maintains iron control even in desperate circumstances. The NKVD ruthlessly suppresses any hint of defeatism. The Soviet people are given a choice: fight or face execution by their own security forces. Many choose to fight not for Stalin, but for their homeland, for their families, for survival. The Germans are learning a terrible truth. They haven't invaded a country. They've invaded a continent that can absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting. By early October, Army Group Center finally resumes its advance toward Moscow. The operation is codenamed Typhoon. German forces achieve another massive encirclement near Vyazma. 600,000 Soviet soldiers are trapped. It seems like the pattern is repeating. Overwhelming German victory. German reconnaissance units advance to within 15 miles of Moscow. Through their binoculars, they can see the golden cupolas of St. Basil's Cathedral and Red Square. Moscow seems within their grasp. Then autumn arrives. The Rasputitsa, the season of mud, begins. Autumn rains turn Russian roads into rivers of thick, sucking mud. German armor bogs down. Supply trucks can barely move. The advance slows to a crawl, but German commanders believe they just need to push a little further, just a few more miles. Moscow is so close. Then in early November, the first snows fall. The temperature drops and keeps dropping. By the beginning of December, temperatures have plummeted to 45 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. German soldiers are still wearing their summer uniforms. No winter clothing has been distributed because the Quartermaster Corps believed the campaign would be over by now. Soldiers wrap themselves in blankets stolen from Russian villages. They stuff newspapers inside their uniforms for insulation. One German soldier wrote in his diary that they'd become miserable, crooked, snotty guys wrapped in woolen kerchiefs. The cold is beyond anything they've ever experienced. Vehicle engines won't start because the oil freezes solid. Weapons jam. Machine guns have to be thawed over fires before they'll function. Soldiers literally freeze to death at their posts. Frostbite casualties exceed combat losses in some units. By December 4th, the Wehrmacht's advance has ground to a frozen halt just miles from Moscow, and that's when everything changes. Remember Richard Sorge, the Soviet spy in Tokyo that Stalin had dismissed as a liar? On September 14, 1941, Sorge sent one more message to Moscow. This one Stalin could not ignore. The Japanese leadership has decided not to begin hostilities against the Soviet Union this year. This intelligence was pure gold. Stalin had been forced to keep massive military forces in the Soviet Far East to guard against a potential Japanese invasion. Now, with confirmation that Japan was looking south toward Southeast Asia instead of north toward Siberia, Stalin could make a critical decision. He ordered over 18 divisions, more than 150,000 elite troops, to be transferred west. Along with them came 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. These were no ordinary divisions. These were Siberian units. Soldiers born and raised in one of the harshest climates on Earth. They were trained for winter warfare. They possessed proper cold weather equipment, quilted uniforms, felt boots, white camouflage suits. They were experts at operating in conditions that paralyzed the Germans. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive. 58 reserve divisions, spearheaded by these fresh Siberian troops, struck along a 600-mile front. They hit the frozen, exhausted German units like an avalanche. T-34 tanks, specifically designed to operate in extreme cold, rolled forward. Katyusha rocket launchers, Stalin's organs, as terrified German soldiers called them, unleashed devastating barrages. And everywhere, Soviet soldiers wearing white camouflage materialized out of the snow. One Soviet commander later said, "The Siberian division saved Moscow. The Wehrmacht, the army that had conquered most of Europe, broke and ran." Hitler issued orders forbidding retreat. He demanded that every unit fight to the last man rather than give up an inch of ground. His inflexibility multiplied casualties without achieving any strategic benefit. The German army was driven back between 150 to 200 miles in some sectors. Over 300,000 German casualties during the retreat from Moscow. For the first time since the war began, The Wehrmacht had been defeated. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. So what went wrong? How did Hitler's sure thing become the disaster that ultimately destroyed Nazi Germany? The miscalculations were profound and multiple. First, German intelligence utterly failed to assess Soviet military strength. They believed the Soviets had 200 divisions in the West. The actual number exceeded 360. They underestimated Soviet tank production. They underestimated Soviet mobilization capacity. They underestimated the Soviet Union's ability to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting. Second, the logistical planning was fatally flawed. German vehicles were designed for European roads, not the primitive dirt tracks that served as highways in Russia. Supply lines stretched hundreds of miles. Delivering fuel, ammunition, and food became increasingly difficult. And catastrophically, German planners had prepared only for a short campaign. Hitler expected victory before winter. So the Wehrmacht possessed no winter clothing, no antifreeze, no specialized cold weather equipment. When winter arrived early, it paralyzed the entire German war machine. Third, and perhaps most critically, Nazi ideology sabotaged their own war effort. By treating Soviet civilians as subhuman, by implementing policies of mass murder and starvation, the Germans guaranteed that occupied populations would resist to the death. People who might have collaborated instead became partisans. Wehrmacht units had to be diverted from frontline combat to anti-partisan operations. Supply convoys were constantly under attack. Entire divisions were tied down in rear area security. The atrocities created enemies faster than the Wehrmacht could kill them. Fourth, Hitler had initiated a war of annihilation against an opponent with effectively unlimited resources and an unlimited willingness to sacrifice. The Soviet Union could replace its losses. Germany could not sustain its casualty rate indefinitely. By the end of 1941, the Wehrmacht had suffered over 750,000 casualties, 200,000 killed. Tank divisions that began the campaign with over 200, Panzers now fielded fewer than 50 operational vehicles. Soviet losses were astronomically higher. Over 3 million soldiers killed, captured, or missing. The Red Army lost more men in 1941 than most nations possessed in their entire armed forces. But the Soviets could absorb these losses and rebuild. Germany could not. The fundamental problem was that Hitler had committed Germany to a war it could not win. The Reich lacked the population, the industrial capacity, and the resources to defeat the Soviet Union while simultaneously fighting Britain, and after December 7, 1941, the United States as well. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military operation in human history. It trapped the most powerful military force on Earth in a war of attrition it could not sustain. Every German soldier, every tank, every aircraft committed to the Eastern Front was unavailable for the defense of Western Europe. When the Allies invaded France in 1944, the Wehrmacht's best forces were dying in Russia. Hitler's decision on June 22, 1941, guaranteed the destruction of Nazi Germany. The failure to capture Moscow in December 1941 marked the true turning point of the war. Germany would never again possess the strength to destroy the Soviet Union. Hitler launched another major offensive in 1942, this time aimed at the Caucasus oil fields. He hoped to cripple Soviet fuel supplies while securing resources for Germany. That campaign led to Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad became one of the bloodiest in human history. The Wehrmacht's 6th Army, 330,000 men, was encircled and destroyed. Hitler forbade a breakout attempt. He demanded they fight to the last bullet. 90,000 German soldiers surrendered in February 1943. Only 6,000 would ever return home from Soviet captivity. In July 1943, Hitler attempted one final offensive at Kursk. The Battle of Kursk became the largest tank engagement in history. Over 8,000 tanks and assault guns participated. The Germans threw everything they had into this attack. They failed. The battle demonstrated that the Wehrmacht could no longer achieve decisive victories even when attacking at times and places of their own choosing. From that point forward, the Red Army was on the offensive. a long, bloody retreat began that would end only in the ruins of Berlin. Every disaster, Stalingrad, Kursk, the collapse of Army Group Center in 1944, the fall of Berlin, flowed inevitably from that fatal decision made on June 22, 1941. Let's talk about the cost of Hitler's decision. The real cost in human lives. 27 million Soviet citizens died as a direct result of Operation Barbarossa and the war it unleashed. 16 million were civilians. To put that in perspective, that's more people than the current population of Australia. Gone. Dead. Approximately 1,710 Soviet towns and 70,000 villages were completely annihilated. Not damaged. Annihilated. Erased from existence. More people died on the Eastern Front than in all other World War II fighting globally combined. Over 4 million German soldiers died fighting on the Eastern Front. Entire generations of young men were wiped out. Major German cities were bombed into ruins. The nation was divided for nearly 50 years. Hitler's quest for Lebensraum, living, space resulted in Germany losing substantial territory to Poland and the USSR after the war. The Third Reich, supposed to last 1,000 years, died in flames after 12 years of existence. April 1945. Soviet artillery subjects the German capital to the kind of devastating bombardment that German guns once unleashed on Soviet cities. Full circle. Red Army tanks rumble through Berlin streets where Hitler once staged triumphant parades. Soviet soldiers raise their flag over the Reichstag. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet troops fight their way toward his bunker, Adolf Hitler commits suicide. The man who ordered 3 million soldiers to invade the Soviet Union takes his own life rather than face capture. Germany surrenders unconditionally 1 week later. June 22, 1941 was the day Adolf Hitler guaranteed his own destruction and that of Nazi Germany. The invasion demonstrated how catastrophic miscalculation by a dictator, surrounded by yes-men, can be. Hitler believed his own propaganda. He dismissed intelligence that contradicted his assumptions. He overruled military professionals who understood the operation's risks. The invasion also revealed the dangers of ideologically driven warfare. Hitler didn't simply want to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. He sought to exterminate entire populations and remake Eastern Europe according to Nazi racial theories. This genocidal agenda guaranteed that the conflict would be fought with unparalleled savagery on both sides. Modern military historians study Operation Barbarossa as a textbook example of strategic overreach. Germany initiated a war on multiple fronts against opponents with vastly superior combined resources and industrial capacity. The failure of Operation Barbarossa marked the turning point in the fortunes of the Third Reich. The opening of the Eastern Front committed more military forces than any other theater in world history, and doomed them to destruction. The soldiers who crossed the Soviet frontier that summer morning in 1941 had no idea they were marching toward oblivion. Many were enthusiastic, convinced they were participating in a historic crusade. Within months, the survivors would be fighting desperately just to stay alive in the Russian winter. Within 4 years, those who lived would be prisoners marching into Soviet captivity or fleeing westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. Few decisions in human history have proven so catastrophically wrong. Hitler believed he was securing Germany's future for 1,000 years. Instead, he set in motion events that would destroy Nazi Germany, devastate Europe, kill tens of millions, and ensure that Germany would never again be a major military power. Every subsequent event, Stalingrad, Kursk, D-Day, the fall of Berlin, flowed inevitably from that fatal decision made on June 22, 1941. The date marks not just the beginning of Operation Barbarossa, it marks the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. End.